the alien empire's unstoppable power. The galaxy was a vast, empty place, with countless stars and planets. But among them, there was one empire that stood above all, the Zorathian Empire. The Zorathians were not like any other species. They were a race of fierce, powerful aliens who had conquered countless worlds. Their warships were enormous, their weapons powerful, and their technology far beyond anything humans could ever dream of. They had ruled the galaxy for centuries, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. No one dared challenge them. Planets that resisted were destroyed. Civilizations that fought back were wiped out. The Zorathians ruled with an iron fist, and the galaxy had grown used to their reign. They were unstoppable, a force of nature that no one could face. The Zorathians had one goal, total domination. And they were close to achieving it. They had conquered almost every planet in their path, leaving only a few scattered worlds that still remained free. Earth was one of those worlds, a small, insignificant planet in a distant corner of the galaxy. The Zorathians had heard of Earth, but they had never bothered to make their way there. After all, it was just a primitive world with no real value. But that would soon change. On the Zorathian home planet, in the heart of the Empire, the Emperor sat on his throne, overseeing the galaxy's conquest. His name was Karn, and he was the most powerful leader the Zorathians had ever known. His eyes glowed with a fierce red light, his sharp features cold and calculating. He had led the Empire to victory after victory, and his reputation struck fear into the hearts of every species across the galaxy. "Prepare the fleet," Emperor Karn commanded. "We will move towards Earth. It's time to claim it for the Empire." The Zorathian fleet, made up of hundreds of massive warships, began to gather in the void of space. Each ship was a towering fortress, armed with weapons capable of destroying entire cities with a single shot. The Zorathians had perfected the art of war, and their fleet was the most advanced in the galaxy. Nothing could stand in their way. As the fleet began to move, word spread throughout the galaxy. The Zorathians were coming, and no one would be able to stop them. Even the most powerful civilizations, who had resisted the Zorathians for centuries, were shaking in fear. The thought of facing the Zorathian warships was enough to send even the bravest leaders into hiding. But what the Zorathians did not know was that Earth was not as helpless as they believed. The humans had been watching the galaxy for years, studying the stars, and learning about the threats that existed beyond their world. Earth had no powerful fleet, no weapons of mass destruction, but they had something else, the will to fight. On Earth, a new leader had risen, a woman named Captain Elena Swift. She was a military strategist, trained in the art of warfare, and her mind was sharp. She had heard of the Zorathians and their might, but she refused to believe that Earth would fall without a fight. She knew humanity's greatest strength was not in its technology or its fleet, but in its resilience. Earth had faced countless challenges, and it had always fought back. The Zorathians would be no different. Captain Swift stood on the command deck of Earth's most advanced battleship, the Resolute. It was a ship unlike any the humans had ever built. Though small compared to the Zorathian warships, it was fast and maneuverable, built with the latest human technology. Its weapons were experimental, but if they could be used properly, they might stand a chance against the Zorathian fleet. As Swift looked out into space, the stars stretched before her, silent and cold. She knew what was coming. The Zorathian fleet was heading for Earth, and they would not stop until they had conquered it. But she also knew that humanity would never give up without a fight. "Ready the crew," Swift said, her voice steady. "We'll defend Earth with everything we have. We may not have the numbers, but we have the heart to win." The Resolute powered up, its engines humming with energy. As it moved out of the Earth's atmosphere, Swift looked back at the planet she swore to protect. The fight was about to begin, and she was ready. She knew the odds were against them, but she also knew one thing: the Zorathians had never faced humanity before. And they would soon learn that underestimating Earth was their greatest mistake. Earth's first contact. The Zorathian fleet advanced swiftly through the galaxy, their warships cutting through the stars like blades through air. The sheer force of their presence was enough to send ripples of fear across the galaxy. Planets trembled under the weight of their impending arrival. Earth, once a quiet and isolated world, now stood on the brink of destruction. Back on Earth, Captain Elena Swift and her crew aboard the Resolute had been preparing for the inevitable. They had trained for months, learning how to use Earth's experimental weapons, studying the Zorathian tactics, and preparing for a fight they knew they couldn't afford to lose. But despite all their preparation, there was a sense of uncertainty that hung heavy in the air. No one truly knew how a human-made ship would stand against the might of a Zorathian warship. As the Resolute hovered above Earth's atmosphere, a sudden transmission interrupted their routine. It was an emergency broadcast, a signal that no one had expected, an ancient message from the stars. The message was simple but chilling. The Zorathians are coming, Earth. Prepare yourselves. The voice was distorted, broken, but the message was clear. It wasn't a warning, it was a call to arms. It had been sent years ago, long before the Zorathians even considered Earth a target. The message came from a species that had once tried to warn the galaxy of the Zorathians' rise, but now it was too late for them. They had been wiped out in a devastating attack. The message was all that remained. Captain Swift stared at the screen, her heart racing. She had heard of the Zorathians' ruthless campaigns across the galaxy, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of their arrival. Earth wasn't ready. Humans were still in their infancy when it came to space travel and warfare. They had no idea what kind of destruction the Zorathians would bring. "We need to prepare, now," Swift ordered, her voice firm. She had no time for fear, it was time for action. The Resolute was Earth's last hope. The crew scrambled to their stations, each member feeling the weight of the moment. Swift knew this would be the hardest battle they'd ever fought, but there was no turning back. She had seen the data from Earth's military, the Zorathians had already destroyed countless worlds. Earth would be next unless they found a way to fight back. As the Resolute ascended into space, the view of Earth's blue oceans and green continents shrinking below them filled Swift with both pride and dread. She knew that their journey into the unknown would be a fight for survival, but what other choice did they have? "We don't have the firepower to take on the Zorathians head-on," one of the crew members, Lieutenant Garrison, said, his voice tense. "They have more ships than we have weapons. We'll be wiped out in minutes." Captain Swift turned to face him. "Then we'll have to outsmart them. We can't beat them in strength, but we can use speed and tactics. We'll fight like we have nothing left to lose, because we don't." Just then, an urgent signal came through on the ship's communication system. It was a direct transmission from Earth's military command. "Captain Swift, we've been tracking the Zorathian fleet. They'll be entering our solar system in 6 hours. They're heading straight for Earth. You are authorized to engage, but be advised, Earth's defenses are weak. You're on your own." The message ended abruptly, leaving a silence that filled the command deck. Swift felt the gravity of their situation sink in. She was the commander of Earth's final defense, and the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on her chest. The Zorathian fleet was close now, its ships so vast that they seemed to block out the stars as they neared Earth. Even from the Resolute, the massive fleet could be seen, a dark cloud on the horizon of space. Swift's heart pounded. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outclassed in every way. But she would not let Earth fall without a fight. "Prepare for engagement," she ordered, her voice steady but resolute. "We're going to give them everything we've got." As the Resolute moved toward the Zorathian fleet, Swift couldn't help but think of the people on Earth. Would they ever know how hard humanity had fought? Would they ever know that this small crew aboard a single human-made ship had stood up to an empire that had destroyed entire worlds? Swift didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain, this was a fight for Earth's survival. The arrival of the Zorathian fleet. The silence of space was shattered by the roar of engines. The Zorathian fleet, massive and unyielding, emerged from the void, casting a long, menacing shadow over Earth. As the ships entered the solar system, their vast silhouettes blotted out the stars, their sheer size unlike anything humans had ever seen. Hundreds of warships, each one a floating fortress, drifted toward Earth, their weapons primed and ready to bring destruction. From the command deck of the Resolute, Captain Elena Swift could see the first glimpse of the approaching fleet. The sight was overwhelming. The Zorathian ships moved in perfect formation, their sleek, angular bodies glistening like sharp-edged knives. It was a terrifying reminder that they were facing an empire built on conquest and destruction. "Captain, we've received their communications," said Lieutenant Garrison, his voice laced with disbelief. "They're demanding our immediate surrender. They're calling for Earth's unconditional submission to the Zorathian Empire." Swift's eyes narrowed. She knew this was coming. The Zorathians were famous for their arrogance. They believed in their superiority, their power, and their invincibility. They expected every species they encountered to bow before them. But Earth was different. "Tell them we will never surrender," Swift replied coldly. "Earth will not fall without a fight. We'll show them what happens when they underestimate humanity." She knew that these first few moments would set the tone for the entire battle. They were outnumbered, underpowered, and outclassed in every way imaginable. But Earth had something the Zorathians didn't: courage. A relentless, unwavering desire to fight, to defend their home at all costs. As the Zorathian ships drew closer, Swift gave the order to power up the Resolute's weapons. The ship's energy levels surged, lighting up the surrounding space like a beacon. The crew worked in synchronized harmony, preparing to launch the first strike. The Resolute had only a handful of experimental weapons, still in the testing phase, but it was their only chance. One of the weapons, a plasma cannon designed to pierce even the toughest shields, had the potential to deal significant damage to the alien ships. But it was untested. There was no guarantee it would work. "Ready the plasma cannon," Swift ordered, her voice steady despite the rising pressure. "We're going to make a statement." The tension on the bridge was palpable. The Resolute shuddered as it powered up the cannon. Outside, the Zorathian fleet was closing in, their weapons charging, ready to strike. The battle was about to begin, and there was no turning back. "Target the lead ship," Swift commanded, her eyes fixed on the main monitor. "Fire on my mark." As the seconds ticked by, the Resolute hung in space, facing an opponent far superior in numbers and strength. Yet, despite the odds, Swift felt a strange sense of calm. She had made peace with the reality that Earth's fate rested on the outcome of this battle. If they failed, the Zorathians would crush Earth's defenses and take the planet for their empire. But if they succeeded, if they landed a single, devastating blow, maybe, just maybe, the Zorathians would hesitate, question their own dominance. The Zorathians fired first. Brilliant beams of light lanced through space, striking the Resolute. The ship rocked, alarms blaring across the deck. The shields held, but just barely. "We've taken a hit." "Shields at 30%, reported Commander Talia, the Resolute's tactical officer. "We can't take many more hits like that." Swift clenched her fists, determined not to let the Resolute fall. She knew this was just the beginning, and they had to strike hard to give Earth a fighting chance. "Fire," she shouted. The plasma cannon flared to life, releasing a surge of blinding energy that shot straight toward the lead Zorathian warship. The beam collided with its shields, causing them to shimmer and crack under the intense pressure. For a moment, the Resolute and the Zorathians both seemed to hold their breath. Then, the cannon broke through. The Zorathian ship's shield shattered, and the beam slammed into its hull, sending the warship into a violent spin. A series of explosions erupted across its surface, tearing the ship apart in a spectacular display of fire and debris. The crew of the Resolute erupted into cheers, but Swift held up a hand to silence them. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice low but determined. "We've shown them that we can hurt them, but this won't end with one ship. We're still fighting an entire fleet." The Zorathian fleet, stunned by the destruction of their lead ship, hesitated for a brief moment. It was a crack in their armor, a sign that the humans were not as weak as they had assumed. But the fleet was vast, and their commanders were ruthless. They wouldn't back down easily. As the Zorathians regrouped, Swift gave the order to move the Resolute into position for a second strike. The battle was far from over, and the odds were still stacked against them. But for the first time, the Zorathians knew they weren't facing a helpless world. They were facing humanity, a species that would fight to the last breath to protect their home. The stakes were now higher than ever. The battle for Earth had begun, and Captain Elena Swift was prepared to lead the charge, no matter the cost. The defiance of humanity. The explosion of the Zorathian warship had sent shockwaves through the battlefield. For a moment, the galaxy held its breath as the Resolute hovered in space, daring to face the might of the alien fleet. The Zorathians, who had always assumed their superiority, now found themselves confronting a human ship that had just taken down their flagship with a single, unexpected strike. But the Zorathians were not easily intimidated. They regrouped quickly, their ships shifting into new formations, preparing to strike back. They had underestimated humanity once, but they would not make that mistake again. The fleet's guns powered up, and the sound of their weapons charging echoed across the silent void. "Captain, the Zorathians are preparing to retaliate," Lieutenant Garrison said, his voice tense. "They're targeting our engines and weapons systems." Captain Elena Swift's eyes narrowed. She had expected this. The Zorathians would come at them harder now, and she knew they couldn't afford to make another mistake. The Resolute was small compared to the enemy fleet, and though it was fast and well armed, it could not take sustained fire from so many ships. But what it had was speed, agility, and the element of surprise. "We can't let them corner us," Swift said, taking a deep breath. "Bring us about. Full throttle toward the asteroid belt. We'll use the terrain to our advantage." The Resolute lurched as the engines roared to life, and the ship veered sharply toward the asteroid field surrounding Earth's orbit. It was a dangerous move, one that could damage the ship or even destroy it if they miscalculated. But it was their best chance. The Zorathian fleet might have overwhelming firepower, but it was cumbersome. In the asteroid belt, they would have to fight in close quarters, where the Resolute could use its speed and maneuverability to outsmart them. The Zorathians followed, their ships closing in, firing beams of energy that streaked through space, narrowly missing the Resolute as it danced between the floating debris. For a brief moment, it felt as though the battle was becoming a game of cat and mouse, one where the humans had a slight, but precious, advantage. Swift gripped the edge of her command chair, her eyes scanning the star-filled battlefield ahead. She knew that each moment in the asteroid belt was a gamble. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and they could be blasted into oblivion. But if they could land another blow, it might just be enough to shift the balance. "Focus on the rear ships," Swift ordered. "We need to cripple their pursuit. Target their engines and fire when I give the word." As the Resolute darted between asteroids, the crew worked in perfect synchronization, their every movement measured, their every decision made under the pressure of life or death stakes. For the first time, the humans were not just surviving, they were fighting back, taking the battle to the heart of the Zorathian fleet. Outside, the scene was chaotic. Zorathian warships fired relentlessly, their beams flashing through space, lighting up the dark expanse like fireworks. But the Resolute was like a shadow, darting in and out of sight, using the asteroids as cover. The Zorathians were forced to adjust their fire, trying to predict where the next strike would come from. It was a game they hadn't expected to play, and for the first time, they were starting to question their dominance. "Now!" Swift shouted, and the Resolute fired again, its plasma cannon striking one of the Zorathian ships square in the side. The ship shuddered, its shields flickering, before a massive explosion tore through its hull. The ship broke apart in a burst of fire and debris, sending pieces of it spinning off into space. The Zorathians had lost another vessel, and this time, their response was slower. They were beginning to panic, and Swift could feel it. The fight was far from over, but humanity was making a statement. Earth's warriors had faced the impossible, and yet, they were still standing. "We've disabled another ship, Captain," Commander Talia reported, her voice filled with disbelief. "It's falling back, and several more are starting to retreat. We're actually pushing them back." Captain Swift couldn't believe it. Against all odds, they were winning. The Zorathians, once a symbol of unstoppable power, were now scrambling to regain their footing. And as Earth's lone battleship continued to strike, it became clear that this was no longer a simple defense mission, it was a revolution in space warfare. "Keep pushing forward," Swift said, her eyes burning with determination. "We fight for Earth. We fight for every person who believes we can stand against this empire." The crew rallied behind her words, their resolve hardening. With every passing second, they were proving that humanity had the strength to defy the most powerful empire the galaxy had ever seen. But the Zorathians were not done. As the Resolute maneuvered through the asteroid belt, Swift knew that this victory, however small, had changed the course of the battle. The Zorathians would not let their pride be crushed so easily. They would come again, with more force, more fury. And the humans would be ready. Captain Swift looked out at the vastness of space, at the fleet of enemies still looming, and she knew one thing above all else: humanity had just sent a message. A message that would echo across the galaxy for centuries to come. The Zorathians were no longer invincible. The final battle. The stars outside seemed to pulse with the energy of the battle, each flare of light signaling another strike between the Resolute and the Zorathian fleet. Earth's lone battleship had danced around the Zorathian warships in the asteroid belt, dealing blow after blow, but the Zorathians were relentless. Even as their ships fell, they regrouped, gathering strength for one final push. Captain Elena Swift stood on the command deck, her face set in grim determination. The Resolute had taken damage, deep cuts to its hull, its shields flickering dangerously low, but the crew had held strong. Each victory over the Zorathians had been hard-won, each ship they destroyed costing them precious resources, but they were still here. Still fighting. "Captain, the Zorathian command ship is locking on to us," Lieutenant Garrison reported, his voice tight with urgency. "They're preparing a direct assault. If they hit us, it's over." Swift turned to the crew, her mind working quickly. The Zorathians had been humbled, but they were not broken. Their command ship, the Vindicator, was the heart of the fleet, a fortress capable of taking on entire planets. Its weapons were so powerful that even the Resolute's reinforced hull might not survive a direct hit. "Commander Talia, get us out of their firing range." "I need every ounce of speed we've got," Swift said, her voice steady. "Garrison, prep the secondary plasma cannon for a full charge. We're going to take down their command ship." Talia nodded, her fingers flying over the controls. The Resolute lurched as the engines surged to life, darting to the side with unmatched agility. The Zorathians were fast, but they were bulky. The Resolute had the advantage of speed, one that Captain Swift intended to use to its fullest. "Firing plasma cannon in 30 seconds, Garrison called. "Shields are at 15%. The pressure on Swift's shoulders was immense. She had led her crew this far, but this would be their greatest test. She had to strike at the heart of the Zorathian fleet or risk losing everything. Earth had nothing left to give but its will to survive. The battle had become more than just a fight for the planet, it was a fight for humanity's place in the galaxy. "Brace for impact," Swift ordered as the Resolute hurtled toward the Zorathian command ship. The Zorathian fleet, seeing their final ship targeted, poured all their firepower into the Resolute. Beams of pure energy slammed into the human ship, shaking it to its core. The lights flickered and alarms blared as the shields began to fail. Then, just as the Vindicator loomed closer, ready to deliver its final blow, Swift gave the order. "Fire!" The plasma cannon unleashed its devastating force. A brilliant beam of energy shot out, its light piercing the dark void of space. The beam collided with the Vindicator's hull with a deafening crash, ripping through its shields and blasting deep into the heart of the Zorathian warship. The command ship shuddered violently as explosions ripped through its structure, the shockwaves traveling through the fleet. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent. The Resolute floated on the edge of space, battered and barely holding together, but alive. Swift's crew stared at the view screen, their hearts in their throats, waiting for the dust to clear. Then, the Vindicator exploded. The force of the blast was so powerful that it sent a ripple through the surrounding Zorathian ships, some of them breaking apart from the shockwave. The core of the Zorathian fleet had been destroyed. "We did it," Commander Talia whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. But Swift wasn't celebrating yet. They had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. The remaining Zorathian ships began to retreat, but Swift knew that they wouldn't give up so easily. Even in retreat, they were a threat. The remaining fleet had a chance to regroup, and it was only a matter of time before they came back for Earth. "Follow them," Swift ordered. "Don't let a single ship escape. We finish this now." The Resolute pursued the retreating Zorathians with relentless speed. Swift wasn't about to let them regroup. The crew of Earth's last battleship had fought too hard to let the invaders slip away. As the final Zorathian ship scattered, Swift watched, her breath catching in her chest. The universe seemed to hold its breath as the Resolute followed them into the unknown. And then, just as quickly as the battle had started, the remaining Zorathian ships vanished into the distance, their lights flickering out as they jumped into warp speed. The battle was over. Earth had won. Epilogue. The Resolute returned to Earth in the days that followed, battered but victorious. The human fleet, though small and unprepared, had shown the galaxy that they would not bow to any empire. The Zorathians had learned that humanity was not a species to be underestimated. Captain Swift stood on the command deck, watching as Earth grew larger in the view screen. The battle for survival had ended, but the fight for humanity's future was just beginning. There would be many more challenges ahead, but for the first time in history, Earth had proven that it was capable of standing against the most powerful forces in the universe. As she looked out over the planet she had sworn to protect, Swift knew that the message they had sent would echo across the galaxy for centuries to come. Humanity was no longer weak, no longer helpless. They had fought, and they had won.